Thanksgiving night, my father laughed. Divorced and childless? You're a disgrace. You don't belong in this family. My sister smirked, rubbing her stomach. I have a loving husband and a baby on the way. You? Just a pathetic failure. My mother chuckled. You couldn't even keep a marriage. How embarrassing. They didn't know this would be our last supper. Judith Williams closed her eyes to the sound of Boston's cold November wind hitting the window. Her smartphone screen still displayed a message from her mother asking, "What are your Thanksgiving plans?" She took a deep breath, put her phone down on the desk without replying. The view of the city from the large office window was orderly, in contrast to the turmoil in her heart. Judith worked at one of Boston's most successful public relations consulting firms. At work, she had a reputation for handling any crisis situation calmly and providing clients with the best solutions. However, when it came to crises in her own life, she couldn't maintain the same composure. A year ago, she divorced her husband Marcus. Outwardly, the reason was for mutual growth, but the truth was much more painful. It all began when she miscarried at 5 months pregnant. She had wanted that child with all her heart. She had prepared a room, thought of names, and made plans for the future. And then suddenly, it was all over. In the face of Judith's grief, Marcus was surprisingly callous. His words, "We can try again," left a deep wound in her heart. Rather than sharing in her sorrow, Marcus immersed himself in work, and gradually a rift formed between them. Counseling proved ineffective, and they ultimately chose divorce. "Are you ready for the meeting?" Her assistant's voice brought her back to reality. "Yes, of course." "All the materials are ready," Judith answered, regaining her professional demeanor. When work ended and she returned to her apartment, silence enveloped her. On the walls hung photographs depicting happier times, pictures from her honeymoon with Marcus, photos from vacations with his parents, and an empty space where photos of the child that should have been would have gone. The phone rang, and it was her father Robert calling. She hesitated for a moment but answered. "Judith, you're coming home for Thanksgiving, aren't you?" Her father's voice was authoritative, more a command than a question. Robert was a respected physician in a small town outside of Boston. He was always obsessed with presenting the perfect family image to those around him. "I haven't decided yet, Dad," Judith said. "Work is so busy." "Nonsense," Robert interrupted. "Family is important, especially now. Now. It's about Ashley. She's 7 months along. The baby will be born by Christmas. The whole family should celebrate together." Judith's sister Ashley was married to Bradley, a successful investment analyst, and was pregnant with their first child. Her sister, who was leading a perfect life, was her parents' pride. "I understand," Judith answered in a tired voice. After hanging up, she stood by the window, gazing at Boston as darkness fell. Her mother Carol's voice echoed in her head. Unable to maintain even a marriage, no children, how shameful. Carol was a former high school teacher, highly regarded in the community. She always had high expectations for her children, especially Judith. As the eldest daughter, she was supposed to be the role model. Judith couldn't tell her family the truth about her miscarriage and divorce. She didn't think they would understand, especially her mother. To her, bearing and raising children was a woman's most important role. The word failure echoed in her ears. Carol had never said it directly, but her eyes, her attitude conveyed it clearly. Ashley was different. She had quickly climbed the ladder of social success. Right after college, she got a job as a successful financial analyst, met Bradley when she was 26, and married him 2 years later. Their wedding was prominently featured in the local paper. And now, they were about to welcome their first child. Judith poured herself a glass of wine and sank into the sofa. She felt lonely, but more than that, she was afraid. Afraid of going home and admitting that she couldn't be the successful daughter they expected. But she had to go. If she ran away, it would be admitting her defeat. Tomorrow, she decided, she would book a flight. It was about a 2-hour flight from Boston to her parents' home. In just 2 hours, she would once again become the failed daughter. But this year would be different. This year she would return with her truth about the miscarriage, Marcus's coldness, and how alone she had been. Would they understand? That was probably expecting too much, but at least she could be honest with herself. Judith took a deep breath and strengthened her resolve. "This might be our last supper," she said quietly. On Thanksgiving Day, Judith passed through the gate of her family home. Fallen leaves danced in the wind, and the sound of her footsteps on them echoed in the quiet neighborhood. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the doorbell. When the door opened, her mother Carol's artificial smile appeared. "Finally, you're here. Everyone's been waiting." As she entered the hallway, she could already hear conversation and laughter from inside the house. In the living room, her father Robert was engaged in an earnest conversation with Bradley. Ashley sat on the sofa, supporting her large swollen belly with both hands, wearing a proud smile. "Judith," Ashley waved. "Come over here. The baby's moving. Do you want to feel? Judith put on a smile and sat next to her sister. Ashley took her hand and placed it on her belly. Indeed, she could feel the small life pushing back from inside. For a moment, a pain shot through her chest. She too had once felt this moment, only for a short time but still. It's wonderful, Judith said quietly. Yes, it's the best, Ashley answered with a broad smile. We looked at a new house last week. It's in a lovely neighborhood in Brentwood, with a big backyard perfect for children to play in. In fact, we've already finalized the contract. Bradley joined the conversation. We'll be moving in next month. Congratulations, Judith said. Her words were sincere but somehow sounded hollow. Dinner's ready, Carol called from the dining room. Turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. The table was overflowing with traditional Thanksgiving dishes. Judith sat on her father's right, across from Ashley and Bradley. As the meal began, conversation continued about work, community events, and mainly about Ashley and Bradley's new house and baby. There's a bubble bath in the master bathroom, Ashley explained excitedly. And we're going to paint the baby's room light yellow. It works for either a boy or a girl. How lovely, Carol smiled. Only the best for our first grandchild. She glanced at Judith. You should go see it, Judith. It might be useful for reference someday. At those words, a moment of silence fell over the table. How's work, Judith? Robert tried to change the subject. Busy, Judith answered. I'm handling a campaign for a major pharmaceutical company, launching next month. Oh, that sounds interesting, Ashley said, but her eyes showed no interest. Bradley was also recently assigned a big project. The conversation returned to her sister and brother-in-law. Judith picked up her wine glass and took a sip. So Judith, Robert suddenly interrupted the conversation. Any plans for marriage? The dining room fell silent. Judith stared back at her father's sharp eyes. Not at the moment, Dad, she answered in a calm voice. You're 38 now, aren't you? Robert continued. Time is passing by quickly. Robert, stop, Carol said, but there was no genuine intention to stop him in her voice. No, let me speak. Robert placed his glass firmly on the table. I'm worried. It's painful to watch our eldest daughter growing old alone. I'm happy even alone, Judith said. My work is fulfilling and work? Robert said mockingly. Do you think work will fill the loneliness of old age? Judith tried to respond, but her father continued. Divorced and no children? A disgrace, not fitting for this family. The room became frozen in silence. Judith caught her breath, feeling her father's words pierce her chest. Ashley began to laugh quietly. She gently rubbed her belly and smirked. I have a loving husband, and soon a baby. And you? Just a pathetic failure. Carol, hearing this, chuckled. Can't even maintain a marriage. How shameful. The laughter of the three echoed throughout the dining room. Bradley wore an uncomfortable expression but said nothing. Judith stood up quietly. She felt tears streaming down her cheeks but desperately tried to maintain her composure. You don't know that this will be our last supper, she said quietly. What did you say? Carol said, still laughing. So dramatic. Judith didn't reply, placed her napkin on the table and left the room. As she went upstairs, her footsteps could be heard heading toward what was once her room. Getting emotional again? Carol sighed. She's always like this. Let's leave her alone, Robert said. She'll come back when she calms down. Ashley shrugged and returned to the topic of her new home. They thought of Judith's words as merely an emotional reaction and quickly forgot them. Judith was looking out the upstairs window. In the backyard, the swing where she had played as a child was still there. And the treehouse her father had built for her. This house, once filled with happy memories, had now turned into a place of pain. She took out her smartphone and opened the airline app. Maybe there was still a flight leaving tonight. She couldn't take it anymore. The next day, Judith returned to Boston on the first flight. The cold morning air struck her cheeks, as if bringing her back to reality. As soon as she arrived at her apartment, she ignored calls from her parents and immersed herself in work. Keeping busy was the best way to heal a wounded heart. 3 weeks later, in mid-December, Judith's office phone rang. Judith Williams speaking, she answered in a professional voice. Judith? It's been a while. The moment she heard that voice, her heart leaped. Marcus. It was her ex-husband's voice. Marcus? She gasped. Why? I want to talk, he said in a serious voice. Can we meet? Judith hesitated for a moment. Her last conversation with him had been when their divorce was finalized. It was cold, businesslike. Why now? She asked. I'll explain. But not over the phone. I want to talk in person, Marcus said. Do you have time tonight? Yes. She was surprised by her own response. They agreed to meet at a small restaurant in Boston's Seaport district. When Judith arrived, Marcus was already seated at a table. He stood up and awkwardly extended his hand. Thank you for coming, he said. Judith stared at him. Marcus, now 40, looked a bit tired, but still handsome. His dark brown eyes were the same ones she had fallen in love with. "What do you want to talk about?" she asked, sitting down, trying to avoid roundabout conversation. Marcus took a deep breath. "First, I want to apologize. I'm truly sorry." Judith stared at him, saying nothing. "Back then, when you needed me most, I wasn't there for you," he continued. "I couldn't face your pain. I couldn't forgive my own weakness." "Weakness?" Judith asked with an incredulous expression. "Yes," Marcus nodded. "I was afraid to face the pain of losing our child, so I retreated into work. But that left you alone." Tears welled in Judith's eyes. "You said we can try again. As if our child was nothing. I'm truly sorry." Marcus's voice was trembling. "I have no excuse. I just understand now. Back then, I couldn't deal with my own emotions." They continued eating in silence. "So," Judith finally asked, "why did you contact me now?" Marcus looked up. "My company is planning to expand to the East Coast. We're opening a new office in Boston, and I need your PR skills." Judith frowned. "A business matter?" "No, not just that," Marcus said quickly. "It's also an excuse to see you again. I've been thinking about you." She was speechless. For a year she had resented him, tried to forget him, but now, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, her heart wavered. "I need time," she finally said. "Of course," Marcus smiled gently. "Take all the time you need, I'll be here." On Thursday of the same week, when Judith returned home from work, she found an urgent message from her mother. Ashley had been taken to the hospital. Labor had started earlier than expected, and there were complications. Judith acted immediately. She flew out on the first flight the next morning to the hospital where Ashley was admitted. When she arrived at the hospital, an exhausted-looking Bradley was waiting in the reception area. "What happened? How's Ashley?" "The baby?" Judith asked. "The baby?" Bradley said in a trembling voice. "He's in the NICU. Premature, with underdeveloped lungs. But the doctors say he should recover." "That's good." Judith breathed a sigh of relief. "And Ashley?" Bradley's expression darkened. "She had severe bleeding, underwent emergency surgery. He choked on his words. "She can't have any more children." Judith caught her breath. Her sister, always perfect, in such a situation. "Can I see her now?" Bradley nodded. "Room 315. She's sleeping now." Judith headed to Ashley's hospital room. Her once vibrant sister now lay pale-faced in a hospital bed. Next to her, their parents sat worriedly. "Judith," Carol said in a surprised voice. "You came." "Of course," Judith answered quietly. "We're family." For the next few days, Judith remained at the hospital, watching over Ashley's recovery. The baby, little Elliot, was gradually getting stronger. However, Ashley's mental state was deteriorating. She was devastated by the fact that she could never have another child. During her time at the hospital, Judith noticed Bradley frequently making hushed phone calls in the hallway. He always seemed tense and anxious. One night she inadvertently overheard part of his conversation. "I need more time. I will pay, I promise." At the end of the week, Judith was preparing to return to Boston. Ashley was scheduled to be discharged the next day. As she was packing in her hotel room, Bradley came to visit. "Can we talk for a moment?" he asked in a tired voice. Of course, Judith led him to the sofa. "First, I want to thank you for coming," Bradley said. "It's been a great help to Ashley." "We're family," Judith answered simply. "About that?" Bradley continued, looking uneasy. "We are having problems, you might have noticed." Judith nodded silently. "We're in dire financial straits," he admitted. "I made some bad investments and am heavily in debt. The new house, we couldn't really afford it, but Ashley wanted it, and the parents expected it." "Your parents don't know?" Judith asked, surprised. "No," Bradley shook his head. "They think we're successful." "Especially compared to you?" he added apologetically. Judith felt hurt but also empathetic. "What can I do?" "Nothing for now," Bradley said. "Just support Ashley. She's very vulnerable right now." When she returned to Boston, a message from Marcus was waiting. He wanted to know her thoughts. After deep consideration, Judith agreed to meet him. During their second dinner, they were more relaxed. Marcus talked about his business plans, and Judith shared her recent successes. They consciously avoided past pain, exploring the possibility of a new relationship. "I've changed, Judith," Marcus said at the end of the evening. "If you'll give me a chance, I want to prove it." Judith looked at him. "One step at a time." He smiled. "That's enough." That night, Judith looked up at the starry sky from her apartment window thinking, her life was heading in unexpected directions. Reuniting with Marcus, Ashley, and Bradley's predicament. And the changes in her own heart. Her phone rang with a message from her father. Being sued for medical malpractice. Need help. Judith sighed. Her prophecy was becoming reality. This might have been their last supper, their final moment as a family. And now, everything was beginning to crumble. As the new year dawned, Boston was wrapped in harsh winter cold. Judith took a sip of coffee while gazing at the snowy landscape outside her window. In these past few months, her life had changed dramatically. Her relationship with Marcus had gradually deepened. They were now meeting twice a week, naturally transitioning from business talk to private conversations. He had changed. His previously overconfident attitude was gone, replaced by a more caring man. He listened attentively to her and tried to understand her pain. His company's Boston expansion plan was progressing smoothly, and Judith's PR expertise was proving very helpful. They were once again excellent partners in work. "I've been thinking," Marcus said one night as they were having dinner at a restaurant, "about starting a family again." Judith caught her breath. "Marcus, I don't want to pressure you," he quickly added. I still want children, and I want to raise them with you." "I am afraid," Judith answered honestly. "What if the same thing happens again? This time will be different." Marcus took her hand. "This time, I'll be by your side until the end, no matter what." Her heart wavered at the sincerity in his eyes. "Let me think about it." The following week they visited a fertility specialist. After detailed tests, the doctor informed them that they still had a chance to have children. In vitro fertilization might be an option. "It's worth trying," Marcus said on the way home. After deep thought, Judith nodded. "Yes, it is." Meanwhile, her family's situation had worsened. Her father Robert received a harsh judgment in the medical malpractice lawsuit, ordered to pay a large sum in damages. His reputation in the community was severely damaged, and his patient numbers plummeted. At 65, he suddenly faced the end of his career. "I'm considering retirement," her father told her one day on the phone. "I can't continue, Dad." Judith was at a loss for words. Her father, always strong and authoritative, now sounded defeated. "I need your help," Robert said. "We're in a difficult financial situation." Judith was silent. The words from Thanksgiving night echoed in her ears. "Divorced and no children? A disgrace." "I'll think about it," she finally answered. Ashley and Bradley's situation wasn't improving either. Little Elliot had regained his health, but Ashley had fallen into depression. She couldn't accept the fact that she would never have another child. Bradley's financial situation had further deteriorated, and they were forced to sell their new home. "We're going to live with our parents," Ashley said one day, crying on the phone. "Bradley's company went bankrupt. He's unemployed now." Judith's heart ached. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "No, it's fine," Ashley said, but her voice was filled with despair. As spring approached, a ray of hope shone into Judith and Marcus's lives. Their first attempt at in vitro fertilization was successful, and Judith was now 10 weeks pregnant. This time, they were proceeding more cautiously than before. Weekly checkups, plenty of rest, and above all, Marcus's constant support. "You're amazing," he said every night after talking to her belly. "Our child is lucky." On a sunny spring day, Marcus invited Judith for a walk along the Charles River. Cherry blossoms were in full bloom, and a warm breeze caressed their cheeks. "Judith," Marcus suddenly stopped and took both her hands. "For the first 10 years we spent together, I didn't fully appreciate your value, but now, I can't imagine life without you." Tears welled in Judith's eyes. "I want to marry you again," Marcus continued. "This time, the right way, to love, respect, and protect you, in good times and bad." He took a small box from his pocket and knelt down. "Judith Williams, will you be my wife again?" Judith caught her breath. Past pain, present joy, and hope for the future intertwined. "Yes," she answered quietly. "I'll be your wife again." Wedding plans began, and Judith decided to inform her family. She called her mother. "I'm marrying Marcus," she announced, "and we're expecting a baby." On the other end of the phone, Carol caught her breath. "Judith," that's her voice trembled. "Congratulations." There was something new in her mother's voice. Respect or envy? Judith couldn't tell, but her attitude had certainly changed. "The wedding will be a small one," Judith continued, "but of course I want the family to come." "Of course we'll come," Carol answered. "We'll all come." On the wedding day, a small Boston church was bathed in spring sunshine. Judith, in a white lace dress, was making final preparations in the bridal room. There was a knock on the door, and her mother entered. "You look beautiful," Carol said quietly. Tears glistened in her eyes. "Thank you, Mom," Judith smiled. "That Thanksgiving night." Carol hesitated. "We were terrible." Judith nodded silently. "We didn't try to understand you," Carol continued. "Your pain." She took a deep breath. "I'm sorry." At those words, tears welled in Judith's eyes. "Mom, you're strong," Carol said. "Much stronger than we are." Judith hugged her mother. Not everything was forgiven, but it was a beginning. The ceremony began, and Judith walked down the aisle, supported by her father's arm. Robert now looked older, and his steps were slow, but there was a light of pride in his eyes. "You've become a fine woman," he said softly. "I was wrong." Marcus waited for her at the altar with loving eyes. Ashley stood as the maid of honor, holding little Elliot. Her face was a bit thinner, but she seemed genuinely happy for her sister. "We are gathered here," the pastor began. Judith looked at Marcus, feeling reassured by the love in his eyes. She looked around, her parents, her sister, and the new life growing in her belly. This was her family, not perfect but hers. "I do," she said firmly. It was a day of new beginnings, a day to move beyond past pain and step into a new future. Judith was no longer alone. She had a loving husband and a child on the way, and witnessing her success and happiness, her family too was beginning to change. 2 years later, on a mild early winter day, gentle sunlight streamed through the windows of a large house in the Boston suburbs. In the living room, 2-year-old Emma was stacking blocks with her small hands. Beside her, 6-month-old Jacob was relaxing on a blanket. "Mama, look," Emma proudly pointed to the tower she had built. "That's wonderful, Emma," Judith answered with a warm smile. On her lap lay the latest marketing report. After marrying Marcus, her life had changed dramatically. They had jointly established a PR consulting firm, which quickly became one of the most highly regarded companies on the East Coast. Judith continued working after giving birth, successfully balancing home and work, and achieving success in both worlds. The doorbell rang, and Marcus came out of his study. "Looks like your parents and sister are here," he said. Judith took a deep breath. Although relations with her family had improved, the wounds of the past weren't completely healed. But she was now in a position of strength. "Hello, everyone," she said with a smile as she opened the door. Carol and Robert looked noticeably older than before. Robert was using a cane, and his once dignified posture was gone. Ashley was holding 4-year-old Elliot's hand. Her expression no longer showed the arrogance of the past, but lines etched by life's difficulties. "Sister," Ashley greeted in a small voice. "Thank you for having us." As she guided them to the living room, the children immediately began playing. Elliot was gently teaching Emma how to play with blocks, and a pure childhood friendship was blossoming between them. "How's work, Dad?" Judith asked. Robert lowered his gaze. "I'm grateful to be employed at Marcus's company. The salary is small," but Judith understood his words. Her father, once a successful physician, was now doing basic clerical work at Marcus's company. He was too young to retire, but had lost his reputation as a doctor. "How is Bradley doing?" Judith asked her sister. "He found a new job," Ashley said, "but the salary is much less than before. We're still living with our parents." Judith nodded. Ashley and her husband's financial situation remained difficult, and they couldn't live on her parents' pension alone. A Christmas present, Judith handed a small envelope to her mother. "An invitation to an open house. It's a new community for seniors that we've built. There's a perfect place for you." Carol opened the envelope with a surprised expression. "This will help," Judith said quietly. "Family supports each other, right?" At her words, tears welled in the eyes of the family who had once looked down on her. "There's one condition," Judith continued. "Show true love and respect to my children, and to Elliot too. They deserve unconditional love." "Of course," Carol said in a trembling voice. "I promise." That night, as the family gathered around the Christmas dinner table, Judith held Marcus's hand. Unlike that Thanksgiving night, tonight's table was filled with genuine love and understanding. Not perfect, but a first step toward healing. "Let's make a toast." Judith raised her glass. "To family, and to new beginnings." "To family," everyone echoed. Outside the window, small snowflakes had begun to fall quietly. Judith smiled. Life is unpredictable, sometimes cruel, but still beautiful and always full of new possibilities. She had finally found her true worth. And her family too was beginning to learn the true meaning of family.